There is something timeless about the nativity scene. A quiet manger under the stars, a baby wrapped in cloth, shepherds gathered close. And just off to the side, three regal figures cloaked in mystery, bearing gifts that shimmer under the glow of lantern light. These are the wise men. They are almost always present in holiday depictions, their camels casting shadows on the desert sand, their hands extended with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They arrive with solemn faces, kneeling before the Christ child in reverence. This image has endured for centuries. It is beautiful, comforting, even sacred, but it is not the full story. In fact, it barely scratches the surface. Much of what people think they know about the wise men comes from tradition and imagination rather than scripture. The Bible never says there were three of them. It does not name them. It does not say they arrived the night of Jesus' birth. What it does say is far more intriguing and far more mysterious. These men appeared in Jerusalem, asking a question that shook a kingdom. They followed a star. They came from the east, and they sought the one who had been born King of the Jews. That sentence alone is a doorway into wonder. Who were these men? And how did they know about this king? Why did they believe that a star signaled his birth? What was it that stirred them to leave their homeland, mount their camels, and cross deserts and borders in search of a child they had never seen? Behind the familiar nativity image lies a journey full of clues, prophecy, danger, and divine mystery. Their story is not one of festive ornament. It is one of pursuit, of revelation, of relentless faith. These travelers were not wandering dreamers. They were searching for something, someone that they believed had the power to change the world, and they were willing to risk everything to find him. The modern world has often reduced their story to a charming subplot of Christmas, but to stop there is to miss the deeper invitation. Their journey echoes across centuries, calling out to anyone who has ever looked up at the sky and wondered if there is something more. It calls out to those who have felt a tug in their spirit, who have sensed that their path is leading them towards something greater than themselves. The wise men may have lived long ago, but the questions they raise are still alive today. What led them to that star? Why did they believe it was more than just light in the sky? And what kind of message would compel foreign sages to cross the known world in search of a child born in a tiny Judean village? This is not just a story of three men. It is a story of divine timing, of hidden wisdom, and of a cosmic signal that pierced the darkness. Their journey was not random. It was foretold, prepared, and woven into the fabric of history. As we begin to walk in their footsteps, we leave behind the simple nativity tableau and step into something much more profound. A pilgrimage that challenges assumptions, uncovers ancient mysteries, and reveals a thread of prophecy stretching from distant lands to the cradle in Bethlehem. This is the real journey of the wise men, and the question still lingers in the air: what truly drew them to the star in the east? Long before the star illuminated the sky above Judea, long before a caravan stirred across the deserts of the east, the identity of the Magi had already been shaped by centuries of tradition, culture, and divine preparation. Their journey did not begin with the appearance of light, but with knowledge, ancient, guarded, and passed down through generations. These men did not stumble upon significance by accident. They were shaped for it, trained in it, and perhaps even chosen for it. The question of who they were is more than historical curiosity. It opens a window into the complexity of divine timing and the astonishing reach of prophecy. The word Magi is both specific and mysterious. In ancient Persian and Babylonian cultures, it referred to a caste of priests or scholars known for their wisdom, their attention to the stars, and their role as spiritual advisors to kings. These were not merely astronomers, though they studied the skies with precision, nor were they just mystics or philosophers. The Magi held influence because they were trusted as interpreters of meaning, men who could connect the movement of celestial bodies with the fates of nations. They belonged to a tradition where knowledge of the stars was inseparable from questions of destiny. In the courts of empires like Media, Persia, and Babylon, they stood beside rulers as counselors, not only of science, but of mystery. Their origin likely lies in the East, in lands where the discipline of astronomy was refined alongside spiritual inquiry. Babylon, in particular, was a place where Jewish exiles once lived, taught, and left behind not only stories, but scriptures and prophecy. Among those exiles was Daniel, a young man taken from Jerusalem who rose to extraordinary prominence under Nebuchadnezzar and later Persian rulers. Daniel was no ordinary captive. He was a prophet, a visionary, and according to Daniel 2 verse 48, he was appointed as the chief over all the wise men of Babylon. This detail, though often overlooked, is critical in understanding how Hebrew prophecy could have survived and perhaps flourished among the Magi centuries later. Daniel's visions, especially those concerning a future kingdom and a coming anointed one, were not obscure within his generation. They were recorded, remembered, and revered by many, even outside of the Jewish community. The timeline found in Daniel 9, which speaks of 70 weeks leading to the arrival of the Messiah, may have been studied and preserved among the very circles of scholars from which the Magi would eventually emerge. If Daniel had students, successors, or admirers among the Persian wise men, his influence could have formed a prophetic thread running through generations. This was not accidental, it was providential. Centuries later, those entrusted with watching the heavens and discerning the times may have still carried remnants of Daniel's teachings. And as they observed the skies, perhaps with scrolls beside them, they would have encountered verses like Numbers 24, verse 17, in which Balaam, another figure from the east, declared, "A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." To the Magi, this was not vague poetry. It was a signpost. The alignment of this prophecy with astronomical phenomena would not have been dismissed as coincidence. It would have triggered expectation. They were, after all, men who read patterns. They understood that not all signs are visible to everyone. To them, the star that rose in the east was not only a physical event, but a spiritual announcement. It marked the convergence of revelation and observation. The heavens were not silent. They were echoing the very prophecies that had once traveled eastward with exiled prophets and had since taken root in the minds of those who still listened. It is this union of star-watching and scripture that makes the Magi so compelling. They were not simply pagan astronomers guided by an unusual light. They were men whose understanding bridged worlds, blending the discipline of science with the sensitivity of faith. They interpreted the skies through the lens of sacred texts. Their training prepared them to calculate, but their hearts were open to revelation. When they saw the star, it was not just a symbol, it was a summons. They gathered gifts, mounted their animals, and began a journey that would take them far beyond familiar borders. They believed the prophecy, they trusted the sign, and they were willing to leave their status, safety, and comfort behind in order to respond. This kind of obedience does not emerge from superstition or vague spirituality. It is born from deep conviction, an inner certainty shaped by discipline, study, and divine guidance. In this way, the Magi stand as both astronomers and prophets. Though they may not have spoken with the authority of Isaiah or Ezekiel, their lives embodied the prophetic tradition. They interpreted a message from heaven, acted upon it with urgency, and bore witness to its fulfillment. Their identity is not diminished by the ambiguity of their origins. It is enhanced by the layers of meaning they carry. They are a symbol of how God prepares people far beyond the borders of His covenant nation, how truth finds its way into foreign lands, and how revelation is never confined to a single culture. Their journey was not random. It was the fruit of generations of longing, the continuation of a story that began in exile and found fulfillment in a humble house in Bethlehem. They were not wanderers seeking meaning. They were bearers of ancient expectation, men whose wisdom was rooted in the recognition of something far greater than themselves. The ancient world watched the heavens with a kind of reverence that modern eyes often struggle to comprehend. To them, the night sky was not a blank expanse, but a living narrative, a stage upon which gods, destinies, and divine messages played out in brilliant silence. The Magi, trained in this language of stars and shadows, were not merely observing patterns for curiosity's sake. They were deciphering meaning. And somewhere in that vast celestial canvas, something changed. A new light appeared, unlike anything they had seen before. This was no ordinary star. It was a signal. It was an invitation. It was the beginning of a journey that would alter the course of history. The Gospel of Matthew records that the Magi saw this star in the east. That phrase has puzzled scholars and theologians alike for generations. Some argue it refers to the direction from which they came. Others suggest it indicates where in the sky the star first appeared. The ambiguity has only deepened the intrigue. What exactly did they see? And how did they interpret it as a sign of the birth of the King of the Jews? To explore these questions, one must first enter the mindset of ancient astronomers. The night sky of their time was not polluted by modern light. It was clear, consistent, and deeply familiar to those who studied it nightly. Patterns were memorized. The movement of planets, the rise of constellations, the timing of eclipses, these were meticulously recorded and passed down through generations. Within this framework, the sudden appearance of a new light would not have gone unnoticed. In fact, it would have carried profound significance. Some scholars believe that the star the Magi observed may have been a planetary conjunction, a moment when two or more planets align so closely in the sky that their combined brightness creates the appearance of a single radiant star. One popular theory points to a rare triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation Pisces around 7 BCE. To the trained eyes of the Magi, Jupiter represented kingship, Saturn was often associated with divine judgment or righteousness, and Pisces was linked in some Jewish traditions to the nation of Israel. The merging of these symbols in the heavens could have been interpreted as a powerful message. A divine king had been born in Israel. Others suggest that the star could have been a comet, streaking dramatically across the sky and drawing the attention of all who saw it. Comets, in ancient times, were often seen as omens, portents of significant change, the birth or death of great leaders, or the rise and fall of empires. If the Magi witnessed such a spectacle, their journey might have been fueled by the belief that this celestial visitor was proclaiming a shift in the spiritual and political landscape of the world. Still, another possibility is that the star was a nova or supernova, a sudden and powerful explosion of a distant star that produces an intense burst of light, visible for weeks or even months. Chinese and Korean astronomers recorded such phenomena during antiquity. A supernova would have certainly captured the attention of stargazers, its brilliance cutting through the regular constellations with unusual and unforgettable force. Yet, none of these explanations, though compelling, fully encapsulate the depth of the star's meaning in the biblical narrative. The text does not merely describe an object that appeared, it describes a light that led. The star moved, it guided. It brought the Magi first to Jerusalem and then to Bethlehem. It rested over the place where the child was. This behavior defies astronomical logic as we understand it. No known celestial body behaves in this way, moving deliberately and stopping precisely above a single house. For this reason, many believe that the star was not simply a natural phenomenon, but a supernatural one, a direct manifestation of divine power, visible to those with eyes to see and hearts prepared to follow. This does not diminish the significance of the astronomical theories. In fact, it may elevate them. What if the alignment of planets, the sudden blaze of a new star, or the unexpected arrival of a comet was not just a coincidence of physics, but the orchestrated timing of a divine author? What if these natural events were used by God as instruments in a cosmic symphony, timed perfectly to signal the arrival of his Son? In such a case, the star would be both a cosmic signal and a divine miracle, an intersection where the laws of nature bowed to the hand of the Creator. The star then becomes more than a light in the sky. It becomes a revelation, a message delivered through the language the Magi understood best. These were men of observation and interpretation, but their skill was not merely academic, it was spiritual. They did not just see the light, they understood what it meant. The star spoke to them, not in words, but in signs, declaring that a prophecy had been fulfilled, that a promise made long ago was now becoming flesh. This mystery of the star is also a reflection of the way God often speaks, through what is familiar, but in moments of extraordinary alignment. He speaks in ways that touch both the intellect and the soul, drawing attention without overwhelming, inviting pursuit rather than imposing belief. The Magi responded not because the star forced them to, but because it resonated with something they already carried, a sense of anticipation, a longing for divine encounter, a belief that heaven was not silent. It is significant that the star led them first to Jerusalem, the seat of political and religious authority, before leading them onward to the humble town of Bethlehem. The journey of the star mirrors the journey of revelation, first calling attention, then demanding discernment, and finally guiding to the truth that often lies hidden in simplicity. The movement of the star was not erratic or random. It was purposeful, timed, directed. It had a mission just as the men who followed it did. In the end, whether the star was a planetary conjunction, a comet, a supernova, or something entirely beyond human understanding, its purpose was clear. It was a signpost pointing toward the arrival of the Messiah, a light shining in the darkness, guiding seekers to truth. A cosmic announcement that heaven had touched earth and that the age of divine fulfillment had begun. Long before the star appeared in the sky, before the journey was set in motion, or the camels began to tread the dusty paths of the ancient Near East, there were words spoken through prophets, inscribed on scrolls, hidden in the sacred texts of a people who believed that history was not random, but divinely directed. These words were not forgotten, nor were they confined to the borders of Israel. They traveled through exile, through conquest, through trade and diaspora, finding their way into distant lands and curious minds. The wise men, though not Jewish themselves, may have found their compass in these very words. Their knowledge of the heavens, as vast and disciplined as it was, gained its truest meaning when paired with the voice of prophecy that echoed through Scripture. One of the earliest and most direct prophecies believed to have influenced the Magi comes from the book of Numbers. In Numbers 24 verse 17, the seer Balaam himself, a figure from the east, proclaimed, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." This verse, spoken centuries before the birth of Christ, may have served as both a metaphor and a map. It united celestial imagery with royal destiny, pointing not only to a coming king, but to a sign in the sky that would precede him. It is not difficult to imagine that the Magi, steeped in astronomical observation and exposed to the writings of Hebrew prophets, would hold this verse in high regard. For them, a star was not just a marker in the heavens, it was a proclamation of divine kingship. But their understanding may have gone far deeper than that single verse. The presence of Jewish communities throughout the Persian and Babylonian empires meant that the Hebrew scriptures were not sealed away in isolation. Daniel, the Jewish prophet who rose to prominence in Babylon, may have left more than just a legacy of political influence. He may have left a theological framework that deeply impressed those within the courts of wisdom. In Daniel 7, he writes of a vision in which one like a son of man is given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that shall not pass away. In Daniel 9, a precise timeline is given for the coming of the Anointed One, often interpreted by later scholars as a countdown to the arrival of the Messiah. If the Magi were the intellectual and spiritual heirs of such prophetic teachings, passed down through generations of wise men who revered Daniel as one of their own, then their journey was not born in confusion, but in clarity. They were not merely reacting to an astronomical anomaly, they were responding to the fulfillment of an ancient promise. They had studied the texts, they had measured the years, they had watched the skies, and when everything began to align, the star, the prophecy, the timing, they recognized that the moment had come. The urgency with which they embarked on their journey speaks to their conviction. It was not idle curiosity that propelled them forward, it was reverence. The kind of reverence born from years of expectation and the careful stewardship of truth. These were men who held sacred what others had forgotten or dismissed. They saw the prophecies not as abstract poetry, but as living declarations of divine intent. And when the sign appeared, they acted, not slowly, not doubtfully, but with resolve. This spiritual resolve reveals the depth of their insight. To journey from the east to Judea would have required not only resources and preparation, but deep inner certainty. The world around them may have been unaware, indifferent, or even hostile to the birth of a new king. But the wise men knew what the prophecies had said. They knew that this was not just the birth of another ruler. It was the arrival of someone who would alter the foundations of history. Their path was not simply carved into the earth by geography. It was carved into their hearts by Scripture. Each step they took toward Bethlehem was a step deeper into a mystery that had been unfolding for centuries. Even the very act of searching speaks volumes about their character. They were not content to merely observe from a distance. They believed that if prophecy pointed to an event of this magnitude, then their rightful place was to be near it, to witness it, to honor it. And so they crossed borders, risked reputations, and entered foreign lands in search of a child whose identity they already understood, not through visible majesty, but through the echo of ancient words. Their reverence for Scripture becomes even more striking when contrasted with the spiritual apathy that surrounded them. In Jerusalem, the very city that should have been alive with anticipation, they were met with confusion and fear. Herod, disturbed by their question, did not rejoice at the fulfillment of prophecy. He trembled. The religious leaders, when asked where the Messiah was to be born, answered correctly from the text of Micah, but showed no inclination to seek him out. The contrast is haunting. The ones closest to the truth had grown complacent. The ones from afar had remained expectant. It is in this tension that the significance of the Magi's scriptural understanding becomes fully apparent. They were not simply acting on information, they were acting on revelation. Scripture had prepared them not just intellectually, but spiritually. It had created in them a readiness to respond, a posture of awe, and a heart willing to journey toward the unknown because it trusted the voice that had spoken centuries before. The echo of prophecy did not fade with time. It grew louder in the silence of waiting. It crossed generations, kingdoms, and cultures until it found ears willing to listen and hearts prepared to follow. And when the time was right, when the alignment of heaven matched the rhythm of Scripture, the wise men rose and went, not because they had to, but because they believed. The path from the eastern lands to Judea was not a single well-trodden road, but rather a network of ancient trade routes, desert passes, and unpredictable terrain. It was a journey that demanded endurance, resilience, and a resolve that would not falter in the face of danger. The Magi did not step into this expedition lightly. They must have known that the road ahead would be long, arduous, and fraught with peril. Yet their feet moved forward, guided not by the promise of comfort, but by the unwavering conviction that what lay at the journey's end was worth every risk. Estimates of the distance they may have traveled range from several hundred to over 1,000 miles, depending on their point of origin, whether Persia, Babylon, or another Eastern kingdom influenced by the prophetic tradition. No matter the exact route, the journey would have spanned weeks or even months. It would have taken them across arid deserts, through hostile terrain, and into lands where foreign accents and unfamiliar faces were met with suspicion. They traveled not as soldiers nor merchants, but as dignified seekers carrying gifts of immense value. Their caravan, likely composed of attendants, beasts of burden, supplies, and guards, would have attracted attention, both welcome and unwelcome. There were dangers along the way that went beyond the harsh environment. Bandits roamed the trade routes, preying on travelers and merchants. Lawless stretches of desert were notorious for ambushes, and even established roads could become traps when the promise of gold and frankincense drew the wrong kind of eyes. The Magi would have needed to take precautions, traveling in groups, moving carefully between fortified cities, and perhaps even negotiating passage through territories ruled by local kings or tribal leaders. Every step forward was a statement of trust, that they would be protected, that their mission would not be hindered, that they were not alone in their pursuit. But the dangers were not merely physical. Entering foreign lands, especially with declarations of a newborn king, brought political risk. In a region dominated by Roman influence and governed by rulers eager to maintain control, talk of another king could be interpreted as a threat. The Magi, whether aware or not, were stepping into the center of a volatile political climate. Herod, the Roman-appointed king of Judea, was known for his paranoia and ruthless elimination of any perceived rival. The arrival of foreign emissaries asking about the birth of a king would have stirred the air with tension. To declare interest in a child born to reign was, in effect, to challenge the authority of those already seated on thrones. And yet, through all of this, the dust, the heat, the suspicion, the threats, the Magi kept moving. Their mission was not hindered. Their steps were not deterred. There is a sense that something greater than them was guiding the journey, watching over them from beyond the horizon. The dangers they passed through did not stop them because their path was held by an invisible hand. Divine protection does not always come with dramatic displays or parted skies. Sometimes it is found in the quiet ways that doors open when they should have remained shut, in the moments when an encounter with danger turns into a safe passage, in the unexplained peace that guards the heart when reason demands fear. This protection did not guarantee ease, but it sustained purpose. The Magi were not delivered from hardship, they were carried through it. The terrain may have exhausted them. The long nights beneath unfamiliar stars may have tempted doubt, but their resolve did not collapse, because they were not merely navigating roads, they were walking within a divine appointment. Each stretch of land they crossed brought them closer to prophecy fulfilled, to light incarnate, to truth lying in swaddling cloth. Their journey, though set in ancient geography, reflects a deeper spiritual truth that transcends time. Every meaningful pursuit of the divine involves some form of crossing. Leaving what is known, risking security, pressing through difficulty, and trusting that the unseen presence that calls us forward will also sustain us along the way. The Magi's pilgrimage is not merely a historical event, it is a pattern. It is the shape of spiritual pursuit, always stretching through lands of uncertainty, always shadowed by potential danger, and always protected by something that cannot be seen but can surely be felt. Many walk similar paths today. They may not cross deserts, but they pass through seasons of loss, doubt, transition, and silence. They face questions that have no easy answers, opposition that feels overwhelming, and moments where the journey itself feels like too much. Yet, like the Magi, they press on. Not because they see every turn in the road, but because they trust the voice that called them to begin. The road of faith has always demanded courage, and courage has always been the companion of those who believe that what lies ahead is greater than what is left behind. And so, the Magi journeyed across borders and kingdoms, through scorching days and uncertain nights. Each mile was both a physical crossing and a spiritual movement toward divine encounter. And though the scrolls they carried or the prophecies they remembered did not tell them every detail, they knew they were moving in alignment with something eternal. The world around them may have seen travelers. Heaven saw pilgrims. The arrival of the wise men in Jerusalem was not a quiet footnote to an already unfolding drama. It was a disruption. Their entrance into the city, with its regal bearing and foreign elegance, stirred more than curiosity. It awakened fear, provoked suspicion, and exposed a spiritual divide that had long gone unspoken. These men were not pilgrims stumbling into the city with vague hopes. They were purposeful, their mission was clear, and their questions struck at the very heart of Jerusalem's uneasy balance of power. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? It was not a question formed in ignorance or confusion. It was deliberate. The phrasing was precise. They did not ask if such a king had been born, nor did they express doubt about his existence. They assumed it. Their only concern was locating him. In doing so, they exposed the fragile facade of political legitimacy that surrounded Herod's throne. Herod, known for his cunning and cruelty, held his position through Roman appointment, not by divine or ancestral right. He was a king in title, but not in origin. The mention of a new king, especially one with the prophetic weight of divine birth, threatened not just his power, but his very identity. The reaction was immediate and telling. Matthew records that Herod was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. This unease rippled through the city like a tremor, shaking not only the palace, but also the spiritual leaders and the general populace. The presence of the Magi, foreigners who bore wealth, knowledge, and solemn authority, validated the prophecy in a way that could not be ignored. They had no political ties to Israel, no cultural allegiance, and yet they came bearing reverence and recognition for a king that Herod had not named. Their question served as a mirror, reflecting the disconnect between those who should have known and those who had come from afar to find out. Herod's decision to summon the chief priests and scribes was not an act of spiritual inquiry, but of political defense. He sought information, not revelation. When the religious leaders confirmed that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem, quoting the prophet Micah, it did not move them to action. They recited prophecy like scholars, but they lacked the urgency of the seekers standing before them. The Magi had crossed kingdoms in pursuit of a promise. The leaders in Jerusalem, surrounded by scripture and ceremony, did not walk the few short miles to see if it was true. This moment is drenched in tension. On one side stand the Magi, whose question is a declaration of faith. On the other, a king whose grip on power is shaken by the possibility of divine intervention. Between them, the religious elite, caught in the inertia of ritual and the fear of disturbing the status quo. The question posed by the wise men was more than a request for information. It was a spiritual confrontation. It called out the complacency of the priests, the insecurity of the king, and the spiritual blindness of a city that had forgotten how to watch for its own redemption. There is irony here, both sharp and sobering. Those who lived under the shadow of the temple, who studied the words of the prophets and awaited the coming of the Messiah, did not recognize the time of their visitation. The ones who traveled from afar, who knew the scriptures only in fragments and through translated whispers, discerned the moment with clarity and conviction. The spiritual center of Israel had become numb. While foreign seekers burned with expectation, this reversal was not accidental. It revealed a deeper pattern in the unfolding story of redemption. Truth, when ignored by the familiar, finds refuge in the hearts of outsiders who are still willing to see. Herod's secret meeting with the Magi revealed his duplicity. He masked his fear with false reverence, telling them to return and report the child's location so that he too might worship. But behind his words lay a darker intent. The spiritual battle surrounding the birth of Christ was not abstract. It was embodied in the clash between divine promise and human power, between the vulnerable light of a newborn and the paranoid grip of a tyrant. The Magi's question pierced through this veil, revealing that the coming of the Messiah would not only comfort the faithful, but also unsettle the powerful. In this moment, the wise men stood as witnesses to a cosmic divide. Their journey had brought them to the gates of earthly authority, but their allegiance belonged to a higher kingdom. They were not diplomats negotiating favor with rulers. They were pilgrims testifying to a reality that transcended borders and crowns. Their presence in Jerusalem, their words and their posture carried the weight of prophecy. They were a sign, not just of who was coming, but of what his coming would mean. This chapter in the story is not just historical. It echoes through time as a reminder that the arrival of truth often brings division. The birth of the Messiah did not occur in a vacuum. It demanded a response. And the Magi, by simply asking the right question, forced a reckoning that neither Herod nor the priests could avoid. They exposed the fault lines between religious knowledge and spiritual vision, between political authority and divine kingship. Their journey may have begun in the east, but its climax would challenge the very heart of Judea. The road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, though only a short distance in terms of geography, marked a vast spiritual crossing for the Magi. Having come so far from their homeland, endured the hazards of travel, and stood in the court of a fearful king, they were now approaching the very heart of their journey's purpose. They had sought a king, one foretold by prophecy and signaled by the heavens, and now they were being guided once more. Not by human instruction, but by the reappearance of the very star that had first ignited their pursuit. As they followed it southward, the sense of awe must have grown within them, each step carrying the weight of expectation, wonder, and holy anticipation. The Gospel tells us that the star went ahead of them and came to rest over the place where the child was. Such a detail, so quietly stated in the text, carries immense significance. This was not the behavior of a distant celestial object, but of something intimate, intentional, and directed. The star led them with specificity, not to a city in general, but to a house in particular. This guidance was not abstract or symbolic. It was real, visible, and undeniable. Whatever its nature, the light that moved before them was faithful in its task. It completed what it had begun. It brought them to the place where heaven had touched earth. What they found upon entering the house was not what the world would expect of royalty. There was no palace, no attendants, no courtly display. There were no golden thrones or silver scepters. Instead, they saw a child with his mother, Mary. The setting was modest, perhaps even humble by earthly standards, but the Magi were not deterred by appearances. They did not demand signs of grandeur or proofs of power. They had already seen enough in the heavens and in the scriptures. What stood before them now was the fulfillment of all they had believed, the embodied promise of prophecy and patience. Without hesitation, they fell down and worshipped him. This act, so simple in its description, is profound in its meaning. These were men of wisdom and status, likely accustomed to recognition and deference in their own lands. They had wealth, knowledge, and influence, yet here, in the presence of a child too young to speak or walk, they prostrated themselves. Their posture was not one of diplomacy, but of devotion. They did not come to negotiate or to observe. They came to adore. and in doing so they revealed the depth of their understanding. They knew they were not merely visiting an unusual child, they were standing in the presence of the King. Their worship was not a formality, it was an offering of self, and it was followed by an offering of substance. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each gift, carefully chosen, carried layers of symbolic meaning. Yet beyond their material value, these offerings represented the inward posture of the givers. They gave not just what they possessed, but what they perceived. They gave as those who recognized majesty and humility, divinity and vulnerability, and eternal purpose in the fragile form of an infant. What makes this moment so moving is its quietness. The Magi did not seek to announce their discovery to the world. There is no record of them returning to Herod with fanfare or proclaiming their find in the streets. Their journey had reached its destination, but it had not concluded in noise or spectacle. It concluded in worship. And this worship, born from obedience and sustained by revelation, is what gives the moment its true power. The humility displayed by these men stands in stark contrast to the pride that often accompanies earthly wisdom. They were not concerned with titles or recognition. They did not return to their homeland boasting of their discovery. Their legacy was not written in scrolls of self-congratulation, but in the silent, surrendered act of kneeling before a child and acknowledging him as their sovereign. In that house in Bethlehem, something eternal happened. Heaven and earth converged. The wisdom of the East met the promise of Israel. Prophecy found fulfillment, and human pursuit was met with divine presence. The scene was not grand by worldly standards, but in the realm of spirit, it was majestic. The Magi had obeyed the signs, they had listened to the ancient words, they had endured the journey. And now they bowed not before power as the world defines it, but before a greater mystery, power made perfect in weakness, royalty wrapped in the ordinary. Their obedience had led them not to a throne, but to a cradle, and in recognizing the King in his most vulnerable form, they modeled a kind of worship that transcends intellect, culture, and position. They bowed because they believed, and in doing so, they left behind more than gifts. They left behind a testimony, a witness to the world that true wisdom is not found in understanding everything, but in knowing when to kneel. The act of giving has always held meaning beyond the value of the gift itself. In ancient cultures, gifts were expressions of identity, respect, and recognition. They were deliberate, symbolic, and often reflective of the relationship between the giver and the one who received. When the Magi opened their treasures before the Christ child, what they presented was more than wealth. It was a proclamation. These offerings were not random selections gathered hastily along the way, but gifts chosen with care, each one layered with spiritual significance and prophetic weight. In their quiet presentation, these gifts told a story, one that reached beyond the moment and into the future life and mission of the one they had come to honor. The first gift, gold, was unmistakably linked to kingship. Throughout history, gold has been the mark of royalty, the emblem of wealth and authority. It adorned the temples of gods and the palaces of emperors. To give gold was to acknowledge majesty. In offering gold to Jesus, the Magi were declaring that the child they beheld was not merely a future leader or teacher, but a king in his own right. They saw past the modest surroundings and simple garments, recognizing that divine royalty had wrapped itself in human form. Gold was their way of affirming what the heavens had announced and what the prophecies had foretold, that this child, born in obscurity, was destined to reign not only over a nation, but over a kingdom without end. Yet the second gift, frankincense, carried a meaning more ethereal and spiritual. Frankincense was a resin used in religious rituals, often burned as incense during temple worship. Its fragrant smoke rising toward the heavens was a symbol of prayer, reverence, and divine communion. By placing frankincense before Jesus, the Magi were acknowledging his divinity. This was no ordinary child. This was one whose life would become a bridge between the human and the divine, whose very presence would embody the meeting place between God and man. Frankincense was not given to kings, it was reserved for the sacred. And in offering it to Jesus, they honored not just his earthly role, but his divine essence. They were bowing before more than a sovereign. They were kneeling before the Holy One. The third gift, myrrh, is perhaps the most striking and sobering of all. Myrrh, like frankincense, was a resin with sacred uses, but its primary association was with burial. It was used in embalming and in the preparation of bodies for the tomb. To present myrrh to a child was to speak prophetically of suffering, death, and sacrifice. The Magi, whether they fully understood it or not, were acknowledging a destiny that would lead this child through sorrow and into the grave. It was a gift that pointed forward to the cross, to the bitter cup, to the redeeming agony that would define his mission. In giving myrrh, they were not only honoring who he was, but also who he would become. The Lamb who takes away the sin of the world, the one who would be wounded for transgressions and bruised for iniquities. Taken together, these three gifts form a trifold declaration that spans the entirety of Christ's identity and mission. Gold proclaims him as king, frankincense declares him as God, and myrrh anticipates his death. In their combined symbolism, the Magi offered a prophetic picture of the gospel itself. Their offerings were not mere tokens of honor. They were revelations in physical form, tangible messages that spoke of incarnation, kingship, atonement, and resurrection. But these gifts also raise a question for those who read the story today. If the wise men brought what was most precious to them, gifts that reflected their understanding of who Jesus was, what then do we bring? In the face of divine revelation, in the presence of the one who has fulfilled every promise, what do we lay at his feet? Not all are called to bring gold or spices or treasures, but each is called to respond, and the nature of our response reveals the state of our heart. The story of the Magi invites a reflection that is deeply personal. The gifts they brought were not just for Jesus, they were also declarations of their own transformation. By offering what they valued most, they symbolically released their own kingdoms, beliefs and assumptions into the hands of the one who had come to reign over all. Worship in its truest form always involves surrender. It is not about performance or ceremony, but about placing our most prized possessions, our time, our will, our desires, before the one who is worthy of all. In this way, their visit becomes more than a historical account. It becomes a model for all who seek truth. It shows that revelation demands response, that divine encounter must be followed by offering. And it teaches that true wisdom is not in acquiring knowledge, but in knowing what to do when we stand in the presence of the holy. The Magi gave what they had, but they gave it with understanding. Their worship was rich not only in substance, but in spirit. As the fragrance of frankincense rose, as the glint of gold caught the light, as the scent of myrrh mingled with the air of that humble home, a deeper truth was being revealed. This child, born in the shadow of obscurity, was the fulfillment of ancient hopes, the object of divine promises, and the recipient of gifts that spoke more clearly than words ever could. He was the King, he was the divine, he was the Redeemer. And now the question passes to each one who reads their story. What will you bring? As the Magi rested from their long journey, having offered their treasures and bowed their hearts in worship, they might have expected a sense of closure. They had seen the child, confirmed the truth that had stirred them from distant lands, and fulfilled the mission that had consumed their thoughts for so long. But as the stillness of night settled over Bethlehem, a new message came. one that would reshape their departure, protect the fragile beginning of a divine life, and speak profoundly to the way in which God directs those who are willing to listen. In a dream, they were warned not to return to Herod. There is something deeply intimate about the way this divine message was delivered. Not through thunder, not by angelic host or temple decree, but quietly in the vulnerable stillness of sleep. Dreams, often dismissed by the rational mind as fragments of thought or imagination, are, in Scripture, frequently the vehicle of revelation. It was in a dream that Joseph was told not to abandon Mary. It was in dreams that Daniel saw the rise and fall of kingdoms. And now it was through a dream that the wise men received their next command, not a suggestion or a gentle nudge, but a clear and urgent instruction. Do not go back the way you came. This command was not convenient. The road back to Herod was likely the most direct route home, the expected path that passed through familiar checkpoints and known regions. It was the route they had already traveled, the one that required the fewest explanations. Turning away from it meant adjusting their plans, changing their course, and inviting uncertainty. Yet the Magi did not hesitate. The same obedience that had led them to Bethlehem now compelled them to trust this new direction. They did not argue or delay. They did not seek clarification or try to reconcile the divine message with their earthly expectations. They simply obeyed. In doing so, they preserved the life of the child they had come to worship. Herod's reaction, when he realized that the Magi had not returned, was swift and violent. His fear, disguised as reverence during their visit, erupted into fury and cruelty. The slaughter of the innocents, a tragic and brutal attempt to eliminate a threat he could not locate, became one of the darkest shadows over the dawn of Christ's life. Yet the path the Magi chose, prompted by a divine dream, interrupted Herod's plan. Their obedience created a window of time for the Holy Family to escape, for divine preservation to unfold, and for the purposes of God to move forward despite human resistance. The story of the Magi's altered route is more than a narrative twist. It is a revelation of how God speaks to those who seek Him. Not all who study the stars or read the Scriptures are willing to be interrupted. Not everyone who embarks on a spiritual journey is open to a redirection that breaks their expectations. But the Magi had hearts prepared not only to discover truth, but to follow it wherever it led, even when that path required silence, secrecy, and a different road home. There is a sacred tension in moments like these when clarity meets challenge. The Magi had completed their purpose as they understood it, yet God was not finished with them. He had one more instruction, one more turning point. Their journey had brought them to encounter the King, but now it was leading them away, not as escape, but as preservation. They were being asked to trust in something invisible once again, to chart a new course, not with maps and stars, but with faith in a voice that had proven faithful. And this becomes a pattern for every spiritual seeker. The path that begins with illumination often continues through interruption. There are moments when the road ahead is altered by divine command, when the route once assumed to be clear is suddenly blocked or redirected. These are not signs of failure, but invitations into deeper trust. God's guidance is not always linear, and His protection often comes in ways that require immediate obedience and quiet courage. The Magi's decision to take another way was not celebrated or recorded by the world, but it shifted the trajectory of history. Their submission to a dream became part of a divine strategy that safeguarded the unfolding of redemption. When God changes the path, He does so not to confuse, but to protect, to lead, to prepare. The road may become unfamiliar, the destination less certain, but the one who guides remains unchanged. The lesson the Magi leave behind in this part of their story is not only about wisdom in seeking, but wisdom in listening. it is about being so attuned to the voice of God that when it speaks, even in a dream, even in a whisper, it is heard, trusted, and obeyed. Though the sands have long buried the trails they traveled and the courts of kings they passed through have faded into ruins, the journey of the wise men endures, not merely as a tale told at Christmas time, but as a blueprint for a life of devotion, courage, and spiritual clarity. Their story, brief in words yet profound in meaning, continues to echo across generations, calling not just for admiration, but for imitation. The path they walked was not only historical, it is deeply personal. It offers a mirror to the soul, asking who we are in light of the truth they discovered and what we will do with the light we have received. Their legacy is one of pursuit. They were not content with intellectual knowledge or distant observation. They sought presence. They moved beyond theories and into action, letting their belief drive their steps and their wonder shape their choices. In a world that often settles for shallow answers or distracted living, the example of the Magi stands as a quiet rebuke and an invitation. There is still something to seek. There is still a truth worth journeying for. There is still a king who is worthy of being found. But theirs is also a legacy of discernment. While others were content with surface religion or political power, the wise men recognized a deeper reality unfolding before them. They read the signs. They connected prophecy with presence. They did not dismiss dreams or despise small beginnings. They had the spiritual sensitivity to see divinity in a child and the humility to worship without condition. Their wisdom was not merely intellectual, it was spiritual. And it calls each of us to cultivate the same clarity in a world flooded with noise, urgency, and distraction. They left behind gifts, but more importantly, they left behind a pattern, a model of how to respond when heaven interrupts earth. Their story reminds us that wisdom is not static. It listens, moves, adapts, and bows. It does not demand certainty before it acts. It trusts that obedience will illuminate the next step. They were not the center of the story. They did not cling to recognition or status. They played their part with dignity and then departed, their names unknown, but their legacy unforgettable. To follow the path of the wise men is not to trace their physical route, but to embrace their posture of heart. It is to seek what is holy, to listen when God speaks, to go when God leads, and to worship when we find Him, even if we find Him in places and forms we did not expect. Their story invites each one of us to become pilgrims in our own way, ready to leave behind comfort, certainty, and routine in order to discover a deeper encounter with the One who still draws hearts through signs, scriptures, and sovereign timing. Their journey speaks today because the same light still shines, the same voice still calls, the same King still reigns. If this message has spoken to you, if the journey of the wise men has inspired your own walk of faith, we invite you to be part of this story by supporting this channel. Subscribe to stay connected with more messages that explore the depths of Scripture and the beauty of spiritual discovery. Like this video to help others find it, leave a comment below, sharing what part of the wise men's story impacted you the most, and share this film with someone close to you, a friend, a family member, someone who may need encouragement or inspiration on their own journey. Your support helps spread truth, hope, and light. Thank you for watching. Keep seeking, keep listening, and never stop following the light.